Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing? This brings us to Group B's second talk show, and I'm going to lead you to Ms. Hausman as she talks about our comments from the last blog.
All right, so on our last talk show, we were told that we weren't very clear and that we didn't ask a lot of questions. Mr. Janikis, you asked us that we ask each other for clarification on our questions, that we actually answer each other's questions. Especially, you said that on Mr. Salzano's portion, we said, great job, Mr. Salzano, but we really didn't answer his question. So we did a little more research this time to be more prepared. And you asked that we had a more advanced conversation and that we had fuller thoughts. So I hope you enjoy. This is our last and final talk show.
Thanks, Ms. Hausman. Ms. Pickerel, why don't you go and lead off the group here?
All right, in Miss Boyle's blog post, Going All Natural, she says, Razu explains how nature has done much to bring people together instead that it is natural for man to be alone. And my question comes from page 51. I'll read the section. It's the middle of the first paragraph shown. It says, but as soon as one man needed the help of another, as soon as one man realized it was useful for a single individual to have provisions for two, equality disappeared. So my question is, once man gained enough authority and confidence, they began to focus on ways they could individually succeed again, just like they did for the savage man. So what made them go back to these habits?
Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, like, for clarification, the habits of
like, having their, not wanting to help others, only wanting to help themselves to succeed and,
So self-preservation?
yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
I think that, if I can go,
Yeah.
I think the pressure of like more people coming into society made people go back to that kind of instinct of wanting to like be the best and like do everything on their own so they could beat out other people, not be like the weakest link kind of.
I agree. I think that we inherently have this competitive drive, and when you use it as a way of only for yourself and not for others, you're going to really, those self-preservation characteristics of a human are really going to start to kick in, and you'll be seeing that more in society.
I also think that it had to do with like this, not the scarcity of resources because they weren't necessarily scarce, but like we talked about a couple times in classes, the trees were growing taller and they needed to be a little bit more defensive about their food because it was suddenly harder to get as well. So I think that's an important thing to look at is that they realized that it wasn't going to be as easy anymore. So it was important.
All right, well, going back to the part that said that man had provisions for two, I think that he's trying to say that this is when, and equality disappeared, sorry, and this is when he was trying to say that this is like the dawn also of slavery, because if he has like 2 apples and all he can eat is 1, then if like that apple goes bad, he wasted it, but if he can like say, oh, like Mr. Strome, come work on my apple orchard, you can have some food, but you have to do everything I say. So then, like, Mr. Strone's getting the food that he needs, but I'm also getting more labor force. So I can make double, and that force will keep growing, and soon I'll have more power than everyone else.
Right, but that sort of seems like the opposite, I think, of what the question was on sort of why do they keep going back to this selfishness of, like, only wanting to do stuff for themselves. So I feel like if they weren't going back to this selfishness, like, attitude, then they would help the people they would want, I guess, to ask for help, like you were saying, like to divide the labor and specify the simple things, I guess.
Well, I think that was their way of being selfish, because this person he was afraid of other, like, savage men, well, at this point, civilized men, but he was afraid of them and, like, wanted them around so that way he could keep a closer eye on them so they wouldn't take his food, so.
I guess that is a way of looking at it.
What if instead of selfishness, it was kind of just that's maybe the only trait that we have that relates us back to savage man today? Does that make sense? Is our selfishness, our need to just protect ourselves and not worry about anyone else?
Preservation.
What if that's the one trait that we can actually relate back to savage man? I don't know. I just thought of that. That was
I
very
mean, I
fun.
agree. I feel like that's very true. But I also think that, Rousseau is so passionate about the savage man, and I think that he's pointing out something, he's kind of very overly dramatic about this. I mean, think of a mother and a baby. That mother is going to give everything she has to that baby, so I think that, and she knows that that's going to help that baby. When 2 men compete, obviously there's there's more of a difference. They both are very egotistical. They both have this preservative drive. And I agree with Greta, maybe what she said before, like maybe it was a lack of resource, maybe it's just inherently savage.
That's a great point, Ms. Bartiz. I'm gonna have to cut this conversation to an end. Mr. Sharon.
All right. I like to talk about Miss Drennan's post from blog post 8. She talks about in this about agriculture and how this ultimately, in a way, kind of led to like inequality. She talks about how once there was like a difference in talent, how people like realized who was like good at like building crops and planting trees and stuff like that, and then separated the weak, like how all that inequality starts. And she asks a question at the bottom and says, do you think that it would be worth it or even possible to continue their farmer way of life without the natural progression of inequality? Which I honestly don't think that you can have like a farmer way of life without inequality, because there's always going to be like that competition to be like the best farmer, have the best crops and stuff like that. So that's my question. What do you guys think? Do you think that there can be a farmer way of life without inequality?
Did you say
involved?
farmer way?
Yeah, how
Okay.
like that agriculture
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So,
Okay.
what do you guys think about that?
I agree with what you said. Having that competitive drive almost makes everyone work a little bit harder to get to the top, and then new things derive from that.
Yeah.
So things get better, and it just becomes more competitive. So without the inequality, people wouldn't realize the differences
Yeah.
between the
I think there would
society.
be no progression without the inequalities.
I think the division of labor definitely helps that because it gives everyone some more time to focus on what they're trying to perfect. And then with that leads to the competitive atmosphere because you're developing something to the best that you can do because you have the most amount of time, and then someone one-ups that. So it just keeps everything improving. So.
I would agree that like the inequality is necessary both for like the farm way of life, but also like for life in general, because like
Yeah.
the inequalities that make people want to do something a better way, which is how we got to here and made like
Yeah.
the life easier for us today.
Yeah, because I feel like without like any of like this competition or inequality, there would be like no progression in anything like that we would do in a
Right,
society.
And we
so.
see that from the savage stage. When we were savages, quote unquote, in Rousseau's example, and we didn't know that there are other people around us, there was no progression. We were just living our lives like our grandfathers and our ancestors were. It wasn't until we actually met others and interacted with others when we realized that there's more to life, that we can benefit from other people's traits, that we can benefit from what they know, and we can learn and progress. So I agree that the farmer's way of life really does help improve society.
I agree as well.
Does anyone else have any last points to say on Mr. Sharon's topic? All right, thanks, Mr. Sharon. I will go next. I have Miss Edda's blog post pulled up, and she talks about an interesting point when she says she brings up the dominance of the savage man. She says that Rousseau says the savage man there is no dominance like there is in civil man, but she doesn't agree with that, and that's sort of where I would argue that there is. She says that she thinks it's the important aspect in nature is dominance among both savage man and animal. So I guess my question is, do you guys think that there is a dominance in savage man? I would agree that there is not a dominance in savage man, just from the aspect of their thought process. They have very little thought process, so how could they go on to determine who's dominant?
Is that dominance between savage man and animal, or savage man and human, or in
Just
modern?
in savage man,
Oh,
if
in
there's a
general.
dominance,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
He does state that the woman in the savage man are the more dominant. They have a dominance over the man.
Do you have a page reference for that?
Yeah, he talks about that in, I think it is page 43.
Because I remember what you're talking about. I just don't
Yeah,
remember.
it's on 43.
I think that maybe there would be a little bit of a dominance in savage man because maybe he can adapt more well than animals can, or be able to survive easier because he can like build things with his hands and use tools and maybe have that thought process to like help survive better than other people.
Right.
Maybe in that way he has a little bit of a dominance. So
Ms. Hausman, I think he talks about the dominance of woman on the bottom of 39.
Okay.
I think it was.
Yeah, that's where I was looking too.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I would have to agree with Mr. Cerrone that there is some dominance in him, but I would think it's only over animals and not other savage men, because he does mention several times that savage man was an isolated man, and so he didn't really see his other kind much, so he wouldn't think to be dominant over them. Whereas animals, you would probably see more frequently and would have that dominance and like superiority over them.
Yeah, savage man definitely has an anatomical dominance because of just the way that they're built. They can see around, they have plausible thumbs, so there's definitely that dominance. But I think savage man compared to modern man, I feel like modern man would be more dominant. Even though a savage man might be physically stronger, a modern man probably is a greater thinker and would, know how to defeat. So.
Right.
Well, what you're talking about is the man and woman, like woman being more dominant. It's the quote on page 39. It says, "Now it is easy to see that the moral aspect of love is an artificial sentiment born of social custom and extolled by women with so much skill and care in order to establish their hegemony and make dominant the sex that ought to obey." So I think that's saying that women shouldn't be dominant, but
Right.
I think that when it comes to love, which Rousseau talks about on page 39, there is some sort of dominance that women have taken under their belt because they were the ones that possibly felt insecure about the type of relationships that they had with love. But I
But
would.
also that fed into men's egotistical mind of let me help comfort this woman and I am doing something better for myself in a way.
That's true.
I
That's
think he
true.
also thinks that because the man has the option to leave, I guess, after, but the woman is sort of forced to stay with this person, and it's the man's choice, I guess.
So kind of like shifting the question, is that dominance though at all? I mean, is the
Right.
woman wanting the man to stay dominance? Because I don't think that a
Yeah.
woman ever forced a man to stay. Maybe she used her womanly attributes to
Right.
do so,
Right.
but I'm not quite sure. We don't really know much about that topic, unfortunately. That's something that I personally would love to know more about, is
Right.
how love and stuff, how that came about. But
Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap this topic up. Mr. Tominick?
I pulled mine from Mr. Osher's article that she wrote for blog post number 9. In it, she talks about a quote on page 66 from Rousseau, and that quote talked about like the foundations of slavery, and it says, "Moreover, citizens allow themselves to be oppressed only insofar as they are driven by blind ambition." And so from that, she asked 3 questions. The first one being if people wanted to be slaves, and then the second one is 2 parts. It says why would they give up freedom for this, and what kind of power would they gain? And I would have to agree that they do want to be slaves, just because later on in that exact same sentence it says, I'll just continue reading. It says, "And looking more below than above them, domination becomes more dear to them than independence, and they consent to wear chains in order to be able to give them in turn to others." So from that, just that one sentence, I think that you can answer all the questions. Yes, they do want to be slaves, and I think that they do gain power from it, because while they're slaves, they can also then oppress other people and just make a cycle of slavery. And I also think that this is sort of where the magistracy that Rousseau talks about comes from. One person would sit there, have this group of slaves, and he'd be considered the leader or monarch in that area. And then these people, like farmers, would have their own slaves to do their type of labor, and other groups. But what do you guys think on that topic?
Well, I understand what you're saying, that you think that people might want to be slaves, but I feel like at this point, with the dominance that was occurring and the fact that it was probably so new, they didn't necessarily want to be slaves. I don't think people woke up in the morning and said, "Hey, I want to be a slave today." I think that they didn't know what else to do in order to have a spot in society, which they said that it was either to be a leader or a follower, and some people just had to fall into the position of being a follower. That's what I think.
And maybe at first they didn't completely comprehend what came along with being a slave, because it also says in the middle it compares dominating to serving. So maybe they focus more on it as a way to serve for their society and community. And it says that according to whether it becomes favorable or unfavorable to them. So it's kind of like the way they look at it.
Yeah, maybe they got drawn into that fact a bit, like you said, that they could like talk down to people. Maybe they got drawn into that fact that they would have some sort of power like that, where they could like boss people around if they became slaves. So maybe they didn't think it all the way through, like what it's actually like to be a slave. So I guess maybe that's what made them decide to become slaves. So.
And I think that some people just didn't have a choice. And even if they did have a choice, they didn't know how to execute and use that choice. When they're raised in a society always thinking you're either going to be the leader or the follower, the alpha or the beta, the magistrate or the slave, they're not going to know, oh, there's another way around this. So I think that they were blinded by it. Society blinded them into thinking that being a slave was just the only way to go.
Alright, well, going off of what you just said, I think Rousseau would agree with that, because starting on the bottom of page 65, which I thought was quite possibly his best idea he has said so far, he says that it would be easy to prove that any government that always moved forward in conformity with the purpose for which it was founded, without being corrupted or altered, would have been needlessly instituted, and that a country where no one eluded the laws and abused the magistrature would need neither magistracy nor laws. I think that in that point he's trying to say like society caused like slavery to happen, and that if we continue with like society, it will just grow stronger and stronger.
That's a great point. And I understand what you're saying, that it is true that if like taking it back to the time that Rousseau was talking about, if we continue with it, that's what's going to happen, and it is what has happened. What do you think about what he says on page 56 when he talks about the unity of them wanting to unite? Let us unite, he says to them, in order to protect the weak from oppression. So what does this have to do with all of that, is my question to you.
I think that like they united because like not like they were already being oppressed, I think, at this point in the story by like just the people that would sit there and want to gain more power. And so then they united so that way that wouldn't happen again. But then later on, where I just read from, I think he starts talking about like the corruption of the magistracy. And so they originally wanted it so that way they thought it'd be a good thing, but then whoever they put in charge became too corrupt, like Caesar did. They put him in charge because they figured he'd be noble, and then he didn't give up his power.
I'm gonna have to. Does anyone else have anything to say?
I just wanted to conclude, I
Yeah.
think that this whole thing with versus slavery versus being higher up is all about not questioning your role in society and just kind of going along with the flow.
It's a good point. So sort of like they were forced upon it to an
Mhm.
extent. Okay. Well, anyway, thank you for coming. Nice Sam or Elsman. I'm sorry.
That's fine. All right, so I'm going to be talking about Mr. Gross's blog post, and he wrote kind of about how language and society was kind of like a chicken and the egg situation, which I really liked that lingo, because I think that that's very true, because it's very hard to figure out whether language or society came first. So basically, what do you guys think about that in relation to what Rousseau says?
Alright, well,
Oh, and this is referencing page 33, by the way, where he talks about it.
Alright, well, I personally feel that society would come before language. Like, people would start grouping up, even if it was like 2 or 3 people, and then with that, they probably just were like, oh, we need to have like some way to uniformly talk to each other, or like have some way of getting our ideas across, so they figured out language.
So, but my question, like, was people grouping up, is that considered society, slowly?
Yes.
Because I don't think that it was.
Okay, can you explain yourself?
I think that family had a lot to do with language, but I do not think that the making of families brought about that, like, a little family isn't a society.
Right.
It
that
caused
was-
those families to join first, then their language, because Rousseau says that language was formed out of the family, and the mothers need to communicate and teach her children, and then society was formed. That's what I think.
Right. That was I'll just go real quick. That was a big question brought up in class. I know Mr. Burmester and a couple others, a few others agreed that a family of 2 would be considered society. So I guess that's the first question that we have to answer is, what is agreed upon as a society? I guess
Well,
before we
I
can then
think-
answer the language question.
When you look at that, you have to see, is it savage or is it society? I think it comes to that breakup. So,
What do you mean by that? Savage versus society, sorry.
right, a savage, as Rousseau defines it, is an individual person, very independent, has no relation to other savages, doing things for himself, not knowing about others. Once you start bringing two savages together, I don't think that they're no longer savage.
Okay, then what are they?
They're a pair, they're a couple, but they're not savage.
Yeah, and they find like
They
there's
might not-
similarities and differences,
Right, they might-
which attribute to that.
They might not be at the societal level, but they are, and somehow intrinsically working together.
So, like families were the building block to society, but you know, and then Rousseau also talks about this on page 30. He says that the mother teaches her child
Right.
the words he ought to use in asking her for this. And I think that family, language, society was kind of the progression of things.
I also think that like the different families that came together like to form one big society probably had their own little like communication language type deal between
Right.
themselves, and when they all came together, then maybe they were like teaching each other what their languages are. Maybe they formed like a universal kind of language and built from there.
So
So
maybe instead of language starting within the family, it was something sort of like a dialect.
Yeah.
And then as these people came together,
then it formed into like a bigger language than it was.
I don't think it was between families either. I think it was just like, or within one family, it was between the like two different families, and then them finding out the similarities and differences between communicating with each other.
and
I
then
would,
so on and
I
so
would, I would say that it was very much the mother and the child, because even today, like we have baby sign language, which is a very primitive way of communicating, and I think that it was kind of that bond that created the language.
Does anyone else have anything? Alright, I guess we'll bring in the closer, Miss
Okay.
Martise, to
All right,
give
so
us our last topic.
mine is about blog post number 8 by Miss Boyle, and she talks about. She quotes page 53 saying, "Things in the state could have remained equal if talents had been equal, and if the use of iron, and the consumption of foodstuffs had always been in precise balance." So she's talking about inequality and whether or not we could actually live in balance, live in equality. And Rousseau thinks not, because once we brought property into the equation, men had like this authority and supremacy over another, and then we basically had this divide between the strong and the weak. So my question is this still the case today? Do we still have this tension between the strong and the weak? Is there ever a time when we don't have this, when people can work together? Do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, I think it still happens today, because if you look in like different workplaces, companies and stuff like that, you have bosses, and you sometimes don't get along very well with your boss, so there could be tension there, inequalities within like a workspace if your boss doesn't like you or you don't like your boss or something like that. So I think it's still around today in a lot of places.
Okay.
And I definitely agree with Rousseau in the fact that there cannot be, like, with these advances of society and these advances of tools and agriculture, suddenly equality has to be thrown out the window. If there's going to be a division of labor and a division of property, there's no way that people can be equal, because people are going to get greedy and self-preservation is going to kick in, as we've already talked about, and it already has.
And to add into that, Rousseau does agree with you. He says the strongest did the most work, the most adroit turned theirs to better advantage, the most indigenous found ways to shorten their labor. So he's saying that, those who were the strongest, the most fit, had the better end of the stick. They were the most advantageous, whereas then the weak would just kind of follow behind.
Well, going off of what you just read, like you could apply that to the armies today. You have like the strongest person, usually the foot soldier, but then like the generals and the higher ups are the ones that are thinking and doing all like the strategy planning.
Yeah, I think that works in almost any type of setting where you have a higher up, and then always have your little workers.
That was a good
That's
to
a really
bring it
good-
into the
yeah,
military.
that's a good
It's not
example.
just
Mhm.
people a lot of times bring it towards money in today's, but when you're looking at the military aspect, it's not always brought towards money.
Mhm.
So it's good. You also look at it as like the teacher-student type deal. Like they just have. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say there.
Like a hierarchy.
Yeah.
And there always has to be like that leader to help have like all the followers have, so that there's a step by step.
Someone has to
There's something to follow.
someone has to keep the rules in place. Like
Yeah.
if you're going to make rules and if there's going to be a way things work, someone's gonna have to keep that in place.
Right. And Miss Boyle even writes, this is a very strong sentence in my mind, that the weak gave up some of their freedom for security. So the weak would give up their rights just to have a place, kind of, which I thought was very powerful. So.
Anyone have any last minute points?
No.
Alright, well thank you everyone for watching Group B's last talk show. See you guys soon.
This is how we do it.